Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox recording here, and let's talk a little bit about guitars. So before I start the video, I just want to let you know that this week I've opened the doors to my guitar production workshop. Now in the workshop, I talk about dialing in a great guitar tone from source, how I go about editing my guitars, and finally my exact process for how I go about achieving a pro level heavy guitar mix. The workshop is absolutely free and you can have direct access to it right now by clicking the link below in this video's description. Now just today I received an excellent email from one of my email subscribers named Christopher. And Christopher asks 3 crucial, really important questions when it comes to achieving a great guitar sound in your mix. So the first question he asks is this: I saw you didn't have the drive all the way off on your Tube Screamer plugin. So it wasn't just a clean boost that you were adding, there was some grit to the signal also. Why is that? Does this allow for less gain on the amp and more detail? Okay, now this is a great question because what he's asking is, why am I using a Tube Screamer before the front end of my amp? It doesn't matter if it's a live amp or an amp sim, when I'm claiming that it's a clean boost and it's, cleaning up the sound and tightening up the low end. I mean, we all know that a Tube Screamer is just a subtle distortion pedal. So technically, it is adding distortion to the signal. The trick is that I'm not using a whole lot of distortion and gain. Very little. The magic in this setup really happens due to the fact that you have a separate stage of gain that's pushing the front end of your amp. This extra stage of gain, even though it's very subtle, sort of cleans up the low end, it tightens up the low end, and you don't have to use as much gain on your amp. So the net effect is a cleaner guitar sound that's much tighter, much more aggressive pick attack, and a much tighter low end. Now it's not always 100% necessary. It really comes down to the guitar player that you're recording, the subgenre of metal that you're recording or hard rock that you're recording. For example, if I'm working with an alt rock band, I might not use a Tube Screamer if their guitar tones aren't that aggressive. If there's a lot of open strumming happening and the articulation doesn't have to be super duper crisp, there's no reason to use a Tube Screamer. But on the flip side, if I'm recording a technical metal band where the guitar player wants to hear every single little pick attack and the guitar tone has to be ultra tight and ultra crisp, I will definitely 100% of the time use a Tube Screamer. And technically it is adding a little bit of distortion, but that tiny bit of distortion allows you to use less gain on your amp, and you end up with a way tighter, more crisp tone. So Christopher, excellent question, and hopefully that clears it up for you. Now Christopher asks in part 2 here, is that better than leaving no gain on the Tube Screamer and using the gain on the head? Now this goes back to my answer when it comes to the first part of your question. Yes, it is adding a little bit of gain, just a very subtle amount, but if you were to just listen to the DI track with only the Tube Screamer happening, it's just a slightly more gritty tone that's almost clean. That slight amount of gain, that slight amount of boost is where the magic happens. So yes, for me, in most cases, it makes sense to have a little bit of drive and a little bit of gain on my Tube Screamer than to have no drive and no gain on the Tube Screamer and using more boost on the head, at least for me. But at the end of the day, there are no rules, so experiment and see what you like best. Now, in part 3 of his question, he asks this: you talk about pushing the beat and recording guitars before drums. What if you don't timeline everything? I use a click to keep things relatively to the time, but still keep the humanity of the performance by not quantizing everything. Is there something else I could do regarding that guitar phasing instead of pushing everything to the grid? Yes, I know it wouldn't be super tight, but I'm trying to maintain the artistry and not make everything robotic. Okay, Christopher, I'm so glad you asked this because this really trips up a lot of people. The thing is, when it comes to editing, people have black and white thinking. They think you either have to leave things pretty much completely natural or you make everything completely robotic and you quantize every little note to the grid. And this is not how it actually is in reality. For example, I'm a huge fan of natural sounding productions, but I'm also a fan of productions sounding clear, crisp, and professional. Now, certain subgenres of metal, for example, calls for super tight guitars that are almost completely locked to the grid. That's just the sound that those bands are generally looking for. Now again, I prefer to keep things a little more natural and I don't go out of my way to make every single little pick attack 100% on the grid. That's not really my thing. The trick is that you want to pocket your guitars if your guitar tracks are pushing the beat. And even worse, if one guitar is pushing the beat and the other one is behind the beat and your bass is all over the place, you're gonna end up with a mix that just doesn't sound good. That's just the reality of it. Now, you mentioned the grid, and it really has little to do with the grid. It has to do with your guitars in relation to your drums. Even if you're recording a band without a click track and there is no grid, if your guitar players are pushing ahead of the drums and they're all over the place, your production is not gonna sound professional. So even when I track bands without a click, admittedly it's very rare these days, but when I do, I still go in and make sure that the guitar players or guitar player are not pushing ahead of the drum tracks. That is like nails on a chalkboard. The problem is a lot of people who aren't trained and don't have a lot of experience, when they hear these guitar tracks that sort of like rub them the wrong way, they think it's a tone issue, or they think it's an EQ issue, and they'll go in there over-processing their tracks, when in reality, it's a performance issue. The other thing I want to bring up is that a lot of people will say they, want to keep the natural feel in their productions, when in reality, they're just too lazy to edit, or they're too lazy to learn how to edit. When I talk to certain people and really get down to it, I find this to be the real reason why they don't want to edit. It has nothing to do with them really wanting to keep things natural, because like I said, you can have a completely organic, natural production, even though you've gone in there and edited certain sections. You don't have to go crazy, just editing certain sections, and your production will still sound completely natural. Even though people hate on editing, they have been editing in the studio for decades, well before DAWs even existed. It just took a lot more work back then, and you needed a lot more skills splicing tape and working with a tape machine. So Christopher, I completely respect your artistic vision in wanting to keep your productions natural, but again, it's still worth going in there and making sure your guitars are in the pocket and your bass is in the pocket against your drums. It will make a night and day difference, believe me. And just because you're doing a little bit of editing doesn't mean you're sucking the soul out of your production. Remember, when it comes to editing and drum samples and auto-tune, there is a spectrum to work with. It's not all or nothing. So I'm curious to know, do you struggle with guitar production, guitar tone, editing, mixing, anything related to guitars within your production? Leave a comment in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your opinion. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. If you're interested in some Frightbox swag, I've got t-shirts, mugs, and other cool stuff on the way. There's a link below to the Frightbox merch store. And again, you could have instant direct access to my free guitar production workshop. I cover my approach to dialing in a great guitar tone at the source, my simple approach to editing guitars, and how I go about mixing guitars. There's a link below to the free workshop in this video's description, so head on over and check it out if you're interested in upping your guitar production game. And until next time, happy mixing.